Tell 'em I'm so free, I got no chains on me. I'm so free, I got no chains on me.
Hi everyone, we want to welcome you out to the lounge where we sit down with everyday people with extraordinary stories filled with hope, change and resilience. We hope that from today you would be inspired and encouraged to make it through tough times of hardship and adversity. So why don't you guys grab a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, sit down on your lounge as we bring good news from our lounge to yours. Enjoy. Hi guys, welcome out to our first installment of The Lounge. And today we've actually got the pastor of the Lismore Potter's House Church with us. And we're going to be talking to him about how he became a Christian and his journey and the journey of the church. So welcome to the show, Pastor Grant Huggins. How are you, Pastor?
Yeah, I'm well, Tyler, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. And this is a new venture for the church, but something's going to be worthwhile, and I'm looking forward to the next 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to dive straight in. So why don't you tell the guys at home, the audience at home, a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, I was born late 60s, and so I'm actually 52, born in 1967. I grew up in a small country town in New South Wales in the upper parts of the Hunter Valley. And being in a small country town, we didn't have a lot, and we were a very large family. We had 9 children and 2 adults living in one 3-bedroom house, and so where it was a very small setting. Dad held down a job. He worked hard, but there wasn't a lot of money around, and so we lived a fairly moderate existence in a small country town that we're in. And we did what most young boys would do in a small country town. You know, we rode bikes, we played football, we did what you did. You swam in the river, you know, and you didn't really think about life too much, but you just took one day as it came.
Yeah, well, so growing up in a country town to being a pastor now. So was being a pastor always a part of your plan, or was that later on in life you sort of chased that?
Actually, I don't know if I ever planned it. If I think back, you know, it's back in high school, speaking in front of the other students and speaking in front of the class was something I dreaded a lot, and so I wasn't like I was interested in being a public speaker. And it wasn't until I'd become a Christian many years later in my 20s and I began to pursue my Christian walk that I felt like I was called to preach and to preach the gospel and to pastor a church and to work with people.
Yeah, wow. And so just talking to prior to this, so you also mentioned that you joined the Australian Army. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, 1980s, I completed my high school. I did year 10, which back then was a school certificate. And I'd sort of just messed around for 12 months, just wanting to find out, I guess, who I was and what I could do in life. And my dad was always encouraged me to get a trade. And so eventually I ended up joining the Army back in 1985 as an apprentice mechanic. And so I did a trade back in the mid-80s in the Australian Army. I was 17 and a half years old at the time.
So joining the Army, did that play a massive role in you becoming a Christian, or is that how you found out about Christianity?
Well, I was in the Army when I did become a Christian. It was instrumental, I guess, in getting me out of the small country town that I lived in. And then as time progressed and we went different locations for postings in the Army, I ended up with finding out about the Bible and church, and those things became open to me then. Not that that's everybody's course in life, but for me, the Army wasn't really a training ground for me to become a Christian. It was more like God used that direction in my life to point me towards the Christian church.
Yeah, and so you're a soldier in the Army. So what was it about Christianity or the gospel that made you say, I want to become a Christian?
I guess for me, being a soldier in the Army it wasn't hard. I liked the discipline. My dad was in the Navy for 9 years, and he actually raised us in a military style. Short haircuts, polish your boots every day, make your bed a certain way, fold your clothes, your handkerchiefs, all that, a lot of respect. a lot of military stuff. So when I joined the army, I felt like I'd already been in the army for a long time. And so going through those years as a young man, the army wasn't a challenge for me to have someone give me structure and tell me what to do with my life. And I just embraced that. This is how you live life. And so when I became a Christian, I was at a point in life where my soldiering or even my career in the army wasn't in any sort of jeopardy, but my personal life was a mess.
Sure.
You know, and I'd had a relationship that was very volatile and toxic and had deteriorated to the point where it was affecting me every day. And I was looking for answers and I didn't know where to find those answers. And eventually God began to get my attention and I went to church at the invitation of someone else, and I became a Christian, and that changed, that revolutionised my life and helped me to fix up all the problems in my life, which most of those were my fault. You know, they were my instigation.
So yeah, you spoke a little bit about, you know, things changed obviously after you became a Christian. So what were some of the notable things in your life personally that changed or were a massive change?
Yeah, a lot of what changed in my life. I was 23 years old at the time, and I became a Christian. And in the army, that was a strange thing because there wasn't a lot of born-again Christians in the army. Most guys were just in party mode. We were all young and fit and had money in our pockets. And so for me to go down that way, it seemed strange, especially all the guys that I was friends with and all the guys that we used to, train with. And so for them it was perplexing to see that. And I guess for the most part, it's like what changed about me was the way I began to conduct myself on a daily basis. That I no longer wanted to drink alcohol, no longer wanted to smoke cigarettes. I no longer wanted to, chase certain things that weren't right. And I began to want to live clean for God, and especially on the inside, and God began to really become a very real part of my life, and it changed the way I lived on a daily basis.
Yeah, and so you're obviously mentioning before that public speaking wasn't wasn't something that you enjoyed. So when did you feel this, this desire to become a preacher, a pastor?
It was probably close to being a Christian for 12 months that I remember listening. I was sitting in a large church in Townsville there, and a young man from New Zealand had come across to preach. And he was delivering a good message, very powerful, very exciting preacher. And whilst listening to this man, God really began to just challenge me internally. And it's almost like I heard his voice in my heart challenge me about what am I going to do with my life. And that I felt God was calling me to be a minister, to preach the gospel. And I knew what that meant was training. And so I guess I responded in a way in my heart to say, God, I'm going to find out. I'm going to pursue this. Did that happen overnight? No, it happened over a period of time. But I began to aim my life at it, and it became more of a focus in my life till it got to the point where every decision I made was based around the calling of God. When I sensed it was a calling, it wasn't just a job, it wasn't just a new position in life, it was a calling that God had placed upon my life.
So was it hard to, juggle the army life and the Christian life, or could you juggle them, or did you have to sort of say, you know what, I'm going to have to just focus on this one and pursue this and see where it goes, or what did you do?
Yeah, army life was good. The thing I like about it is it's very disciplined, and that actually helps men a lot, So we all need discipline in life. If you're going to achieve anything in life, you really do need to have some structure. And so for me, having that structure already in place wasn't even a challenge. So when I began to, pursue the calling, and I knew that I had to be trained by someone because I didn't have on board everything I needed. I knew that. I didn't like talking to people. I didn't like talking in front of people. And so I had to be trained in those things. And so God was able to put me in the presence of other men that were willing to do that. And so having that training aspect already implanted in my life was easy for me. When it came to being a disciple, and wanting to fulfill what God had called my life to.
And so obviously you gained some skills from the army, and so is that what you did whilst you were a Christian, sort of just adapt your life more around your faith, your belief? But so what did you do after the army that would help you, I guess, free up time to focus on being a Christian?
I left the army after 10 years, so 1995 I discharged from the army, having done 10 years of service. And by then I was already disciplined in my life, and so I didn't change a lot when I got out. I was still maintaining my disciplines of morning prayer and reading my Bible and studying the Word of God, and outreaching and witnessing and having people over for fellowship, and trying to connect with sinners and attending church events and church conferences. So none of that changed. All that really changed was I just changed my vocation. I went from not being in the army to now being in civilian life, and I began to use my trade in a way to help to just get a job so that I could be available for what God was calling me to.
Yeah, and so so when did you plan to come to Lismore and pastor the church, or how did the opportunity arise?
Yeah, there was no plan at all to come here. Back in 2011, actually 9 years ago this weekend is when we actually landed here. But back in 2011, we went to our annual Bible conference in Perth, and halfway through that week of ministry, my pastor spoke to me about an opportunity that had become available in Lismore. I knew Lismore was close to Queensland. It was in the northern parts of New South Wales. I didn't really know where it was. I'd never visited the place. But I knew some of the people that were in the church here. And so it wasn't unfamiliar, but it was unfamiliar in the fact that we'd never been there. And Jody, my wife, and myself, we basically made the decision that we would take the opportunity, and we sensed that God was involved in that. And so we said yes to come to Lismore. That was 2011 that we did that.
Yeah, and I guess for the viewers at home, something that struck me as well is the fact that you've moved to Lismore, but what a lot of people don't know is so you have a family, you're married, you have kids, and you have a successful business. But within a blink of an eye, you've just left all that to move to a place, in your own words, that you didn't really know much about or couldn't find on a map. Was there a particular reason behind that?
Yeah, I think if I look back at the reasoning as to why we left, was that we sensed that this was God helping us and directing us, and we didn't want to get in the road. You know, we didn't want to create a stumbling block there in our own lives, by saying to God, we'll do what you want as long as it's on our terms. Yeah. You know, and so we decided, okay, let's say yes to this, and then every decision we make after this will be subject to the fact that we said yes to God, to come to Lismore. And so we basically had to rearrange our lives to get here, rearrange business, and all sorts of things to get here. But in landing here, we sensed that God was with us, and that we really have seen the hand of God, the favour of God upon our lives, which confirmed to us that this was the right decision to make.
Yeah, and so and just on that, so landing here, so you've just come to this place you don't know much about, and what was your first thoughts when you looked at Lismore as a town?
It was obviously bigger than the town I grew up in, but it was smaller than the place where I came from. I was in Townsville for many years, and having been in Townsville was a very progressive place, and a lot of industry and very go-ahead. It's a town now of 200,000 people, whereas Lismore was just below 30,000 now in the city. And so coming here was different, I guess, in the mindset that we encountered amongst people here. And I guess for us it was a change in an atmosphere in a way, and we felt like we were up against different battles, and there were different challenges ahead than we had in Townsville. But we just felt like that we were in the right place, and that God, you're going to help us through, everything that's different about Lismore, the alternative lifestyle that's very prevalent here, you know, all the different aspects that come with that. But we felt like God was going to help us through all of that, and looking back over 9 years, we can see God really has done that, you know.
And so when you came to Lismore originally, where was the church at, or what state was it in when you arrived and when you took over?
The church in Lismore had been in place for quite some time. It was pioneered back in the late 80s, and so the church had seen some significant growth and had a couple of pastoral changes, and had at one time was quite strong, and were making roads into planting churches into other cities, which is the vision of our fellowship and really the vision of the New Testament church, you know. And so the church had done that, but when we got here, the church had taken a very significant hit, and things weren't the way they used to be. And so we basically had to, in a way, start again with the people that were left. And we felt encouraged that God was still at work here, even amongst the few people that were left here. And I guess we encouraged them, and they encouraged us, and we worked together, and God was able to relay a foundation there and to build something upon.
And so when you talk about relaying a foundation, just as a pastor, you know, moving here with your family, what were some of the things that you believed God for that you needed to rebuild this work in Lismore?
Many years ago in Townsville, I got to a point in my Christian life where I got desperate with God about reaching men in particular and seeing them make lasting decisions to be a part of the church. You know, for most Aussies, they think the church is attractive for women and for kids or for elderly folk, but the real Christian church is attractive for men, and this is what will make a masculine man out of you. Is to give your life to Jesus. And so I began to press God about that many years before I came to Lismore. So when we came here, and God had given me fruit in Townsville there, and when we came here, we believed God for the same thing, but it was very clear to me if the church was going to survive, we needed young men, that God would get a hold of their hearts and begin to build the church around those people. And looking back at the 9 years we've been here, God has answered our prayer in giving us young men, and God has rebuilt the church around those people for His glory. You know, we were just instruments in that whole process.
Yeah, and just on that, so obviously you've got young men coming and whatnot, and this fellowship is so focused on mentoring and discipleship. But obviously for young men, especially in this generation, something that plagues this generation is fatherless homes. And so was that something you ran into working with the young guys that were coming in at the time?
Oh, absolutely, you know. And so part of the discipleship that we conduct, it really does come across in a father-son type relationship, you know. Being a Christian disciple is not just attending church once a week and then doing your own thing for the rest of the week, but it really is. Right. It's an everyday relationship that you have with God, but that you also have with your pastor or the people in the church. And so when you don't have that relationship there with people in the church or your pastor, then your Christianity becomes, in a way, quite shallow and quite narrow, and God is limited many times in what He can do. What we did was we just began to invest into young men and, you know, fellowship with them, which is a Christian term for we'd eat food with them. Yeah. The number of times that my wife would cook 3 kilos of chicken wings and we'd have a house full of young men was a regular thing, but, you know, that whole process there was the way God was going to rebuild this church here. And I think the men that were attracted to us were men that hadn't had the greatest of role models in growing up, you know, and so we're all looking for role models, you know, and so part of me becoming a Christian and a disciple, I found some very good role models that were able to help me as well, to help sort out some of the things that were sort of left neglected in my own life when I was younger. And that whole process of being a Christian disciple, God actually has put that into the relationship with your pastor so that you can have a man, in a way, help you through some of the challenges internally in your life.
Yeah, and so I've obviously know some of these men and whatnot, and so they've come in as young men, and so what can you tell us? Where are they? What are they up to now? What are they doing in life?
You know, the guys that we have, that we prayed for, that have lasted, they've gotten married, or in the process of getting married, and they're building a life with God, you know, so their marriages are great marriages. It is rare to see young men and women nowadays unite together under God in marriage. You know, marriage has become a hot topic in this generation, and God's design for marriage hasn't changed. It's still the same. It's still man and a woman. And for young men in the church that have done that, you can see God has brought an acceleration to their life. There's been an adding to their life, and you can see that what God is doing amongst these young couples is He's building something that's going to last for a very long time, but something that you can take and begin to plant that into other places as well.
And yeah, it's been amazing, you know, obviously watching young men come in and get their lives together and get married and whatnot. But obviously being a pastor, you've seen a lot. What are some of your highlights just pastoring in Lismore that you've been here for 9 years now, yeah?
Yeah, 9 years. Some of the highlights, I really have to say, the things that stand out to me the most, or that mean the most to me, are the changed lives, you know, of people that are in the church. You know, when I think about the wide range of personalities that we have in the church and how God has brought them in, like He individually cared for each person, how God has brought those people in and united them together as a team or a church that are able to function well, they're able to have impact. Some of the highlights, when I think of highlights, I think of the people's lives that have been rescued. And I could name names, but I don't really want to do that. But I could say that Jesus Christ really has changed some people's lives in the last 9 years, and those lives have been affected for good, and that will last forever.
And so obviously seeing the church, such a healthy church, you know, healthy growth. Where's the church at now, and where do you see the church headed?
Yeah, where we're at right now is we're in that stage of we've built a strong core, and like anything, once you've built the core strong, then you can have growth on top of that. Yeah. Without a strong core, you can't have the growth. And so we do have a strong core. We have people that are committed, young people that are committed. It's very noticeable in this city. The people I know, that I run into, know who I am, and they already have an opinion about the people in the church, and they're very impressed with that. It tells me that God's using this church to advertise to the community what He can do in people's lives. And so the church is strong in its core, and we are heading in the right direction. We are aiming for full-time ministry here, but for the planting of churches into other towns and other cities, because there are many other places just like Lismore that need the gospel. They need a clear-cut message of the gospel, and young men and women need to be discipled in those places. And so as a church, we have fashioned ourselves to do that. We have different levels of ministry that people can step into to begin to train them up so that they can go out there and do what they feel God's calling them to do as well. And we're going to support that. And we are a church that plants other churches, and that's where we're heading in the not too distant future.
And so, like I said before, you've been here for 9 years. When you first arrived, did you think that you'd be here for 9 years?
Yeah, in my first month, maybe not. But after a while, I got with my pastor, who's now the area leader, and he encouraged me to have a 10-year plan. You know, you have to think long term. And so I did back then begin to formulate in my mind where I think the church could be 10 years from now. And have we gone on a trajectory to hit that? And not always, because life has its ups and downs, but I do believe that we are heading definitely in that direction. and I did have a 10-year plan, and that we would have churches out around that time. And so we're not too far from that, and I feel like God has helped us to get to that point.
And obviously nothing's changed, even with, you know, the coronavirus and all that's going on in the world. You still believe that that's the plan, and we're going to execute that, yeah?
I still believe that, because if you think about history and church history even, you know, the Christian church has been around for 2,000 years. It's been through tougher restrictions than this. It's been through tougher times than this. But where we are right now in human history is we are in the last days, and the church has never had more access now to technology and to finances and even people themselves and to a great harvest field. And so whilst this whole crisis may be a surprise to this present generation, it's not a surprise to God. It's not a surprise to Jesus, who's in charge of the church. And he's still moving things around. He's still doing things in the background to make sure that his church ends up exactly where it needs to be. And so I'm encouraged by what God's doing. Even at this time, there have been people that have given their lives to Jesus in the last 3 or 4 weeks, even though we haven't been able to meet as a church, you know. And God has been preparing this church a long time, even before we realised that God was preparing this church for a time like this. Every person, as we record this, every person in the church still has their job. You know, no one's lost their job. Some people have taken small wage cuts, but for the most part, everyone still has a position in the place of employment where they were before this crisis started. And I can see God has manoeuvred things around for that to happen, and which means that God's interested in how his church functions and survives through this whole period.
And just for, I guess, not people just a part of this congregation, but just believers out there who may be through this time, I guess, are sort of worried about, you know, what's going to happen to them. And from a pastor, what's some pastoral advice you can give to these people about, you know, just staying focused that everything is going to be all right?
Yeah, I think for the most part, my advice would be, first of all, if you're not a Christian, now is the opportunity for you to become a Christian. The headlines that you see happening around the world line up with Bible prophecy, and everything is pushing towards what the Bible says would happen in the last days. And I think the emphasis ought to be on you make sure that you're right with God, okay? Because he has a plan for your life, and this hasn't taken him by surprise at all. But he has a plan for you, and he can help you through this whole period, this whole crisis, all these restrictions. And maybe in a way, what God's doing by highlighting his scripture and making it relevant at this time is he's actually advertising to the world that there is still time for you to get your life right with Christ. He came 2,000 years ago. He died on the cross. He did that for you. He did that for me. All I've done is accepted that into my life and followed him, and he has a plan for your life, and he'll do the same for you. If you just give yourself to him, you just surrender, because you know what? You're not in control, and you sense that. I tell you, God's in control. And when you put yourself in the center of his will, you know, you have nothing to fear.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, and that wraps up today's series. We want to thank you guys for joining us as well. This will be available on Instagram and also on our YouTube channel. So why don't you hit Instagram, follow us, and also on our YouTube channel, why don't you subscribe, that you'll get notifications every time we post something brand new. But again, thank you for joining us today, Pastor Huggins.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm so free, I got no